Thank you,
You're welcome.
Katarina, and thank you, Naventus, for the opportunity to speak and attend this event. I've been following with interest the presentations this morning. There's a lot of exciting things going on. I'm also very pleased to see several of our clients and friends here, and I hope to make new acquaintances during the course of the rest of the day. Yeah, Martin Sandgren. I'm from Setterwalls. We're one of the biggest law firms in Sweden. We're full service. Of course, we do a lot of general business law advice, corporate capital markets, and etc. We're very active in the capital markets segment, both listings and bonds. But we also do a lot of work, and particularly I, and my team, I head up the energy and infrastructure practice at the firm. So we have a big focus on that, and particularly renewables, which is a very big part of our business over the last couple of years, and we see it will be in the foreseeable future too. So it's very interesting to be here today. So we deal with wind as a big part, solar. I've done biogas, waste-to-energy projects, district heating, electromobility is becoming big within the area now. We're not talking so much about that today. That's the smaller scale part of it, but electricity being plugged into it. And transmission, not least transmission and storage of energy or electricity, which is a big part of this energy transition we're in. Enough about us and what we're doing. I think that was here. I'm not so big on slides for this. So I think we all know the background and the drivers of why we're here today and what's going on. We have the global warming, a lot of CO2 emissions. We need this change to renewables and more sustainable sources. And we're taking this a little bit from a Swedish perspective. I know there are a lot of companies and investors with international perspective here today, and if you look at developing new technologies, much of the market may be internationally. I mean, we have experience from that too. I mean, we very recently closed an offshore floating wind project in France, for example. But here, this is more of a Swedish perspective on what's been driving it here, and also regulatory and other aspects and challenges from an investor's perspective if you're investing in Sweden. So it's interesting to see it in relief then to many other countries. And I've done a lot of work in Africa, for example, over the years. There is the opposite. So one reason why the Swedish market is very hot today, it's very simple, we take it for granted. It's political stability, low corruption levels, even if there's few wrinkles here on that in the last few years, but that relatively speaking, it's very open. We have no foreign investment restrictions really, and no capital flow restrictions really either. It's a very transparent market, and for the last soon 5 years, it's been a very stable political regime for investments in Sweden through the energy deal of 2016, which even if the market was big before, created a real boom. So there's been a tremendous amount of investments in Sweden since then. Also driven by the lowering of costs of the more mature renewable technologies, primarily wind. If you look at volumes of new investments, that's where you see the main part of it. And then one driving factor there too is that Sweden, compared to many other European countries in the neighborhood, has a basically lower cost of investment for that. Also, we have a lot of land, and up north, and wind conditions are good, which has driven that. But to get to the core to this, what are some of the challenges or peculiarities in the Swedish regulatory and legal regime which affects investors in this market? This goes both for wind and all type of renewable energy, or at least electricity. So this is more when you get to the development of projects and building things stage. Before that, when you look at developing the technologies in itself, I mean, that's pretty much an open field. But you need to keep this in mind when you're developing the technologies and also raising finance for projects. So one of the main things going on at the moment and been going on for some time is related to the subsidy system in Sweden. So in Sweden, for renewable energy, or actually for renewably produced electricity, there's something called the electricity certificate system. I know there are differences here in experience with this, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, basically the way that renewable electricity has been subsidized, and still is to some extent in Sweden, is it's not by a feed-in tariff, by a guaranteed price, but that suppliers of electricity to consumers have an obligation to have a certain percentage of renewable electricity in its mix. And if they don't have that, they pay penalties. So they basically then buy renewable electricity from producers of that, and there are certificates for that in order to prove that you have that. So this system was introduced, I think it was around 2003, and there was so like a curve for increasing quotas, since we require higher and higher levels of renewables in the system, and that was based on a projection of that we would reach certain levels at certain points in time. So what has happened is that we basically have reached today the goals we had for 2030, which has led to that those certificates, which have a price, they're traded in a market. So basically you can choose between having the certificate, which has a market value, or you pay the penalty to the government. So the certificate costs a little bit more than what the penalty would cost. But since there's more of these certificates than one expected at this point in time, the price has collapsed, which has led to that many of the original investors in this, the business models are not really working any longer, since they had assumed that the market would develop in line with the expectations. So this is sort of like the backside of the coin for some of the investors of the fast build-out of renewables. So if you're a new investor today, you need to you probably should almost disregard this system, because it's going to be phased out over the next couple of years, whereas in any event it ends at 2030. But the key point is that the value of those certificates is very low. And if you're investing in an older project, you need to keep it in mind too. Another key aspect for bringing the developments up to even higher level is that the Swedish, even if there's very limited bureaucracy in Sweden, the permitting and application process for new projects is fairly slow, and it's a dual system where you might need 2 permits, at least for larger projects, because you need both a building permit and an environmental permit. For smaller projects, they're basically combined. But it's dual processes, and there are also other authorities which have influence over the permits. The processes are pretty slow, take a long time, not least because the responsible authority doesn't really have the resources it needs to handle the applications quickly, not least of a process of testing again the permits for small hydropower plants, basically thousands of these, so the authority is overloaded by that. In addition to that, there is a big uncertainty with a municipal veto. So you need to keep this in mind, that the municipalities where you are developing the project have the right at the beginning and basically throughout the entire permitting process up until you start building to stop the project, even if they've said yes before. And there are some unpleasant surprises for investors that after a change in government and the local government after an election, that they've changed their mind. This is under review, there's been hearing rounds, and there are proposals to either abolish or limit that veto right. But until then, you need to ensure that you have a very good relationship with the municipality in order to avoid them using their veto. Since the risk there is that if you're very advanced in your process and they say no, that you have sunk costs of developing and cannot go on with the project. A couple of other things, not so much the legal in itself, but closely related to it, because these things are done by regulated organizations. There's basically a bottleneck in grid, or grid capacity, or in local capacity. So when a lot of new electricity is built up north and needs to be transported down south to the regions we are in and down to Skåne, the grid is not big enough really to carry that and efficiently get the electricity where it needs to be. So similarly, as much as they need investment in the power production, the grid and the transmission, and also, as we see, storage, intermittent storage at least, for the electricity overnight or when it is needed, particularly if it's wind power. That is one of the other bottlenecks in the system in Sweden, in addition to transmission. Another factor to keep an eye on is that the energy deal is weakening. Even if it's there with all the main parties since 2016, it appears that the conservatives or the moderates or the Democrats, they are at least partially not supporting it any longer. There's a lot of debate on whether to carry on or whether to start decommissioning nuclear or not. We are involved in some of these discussions. You might know that one of the reactors, which is of sort of like 700 megawatts, if I recall correctly from the top of my head, was closed down in December. And the next one is expected to be closed down during the course of this year. So that's creating some political instability, even if it is not a complete disruption of it. And I think these are some of the main challenges which you need to keep in mind when you're investing in Sweden. And there are not big clouds on the sky, but you just need to be aware of them and deal with them and work with them. Just very quickly, last thing on trends. I think I mentioned it, projects are getting bigger and bigger. There's a tremendous amount of foreign investment into Sweden in this area. If you look at new power plants, at least, wind, which is basically the vast majority of that is foreign capital. So a lot of opportunities there for both Swedish investors to pick it up and for more foreign capital. And the other big trend, I would say, that's big corporate PPAs. We're hearing here about the big electricity-intensive industries. They are entering into long-term electricity supply agreements. You have big tech giants like Google and Amazon that put their service up in the north of Sweden, ensure that they get long-term supply, 15, 20-year-long contracts, which then basically make it possible to finance this big new wind farms in our power plants. So that's a very big driving factor too. I think that was my main observations from an investor perspective as a player in the legal market for services for the renewables industry. And the floor is open for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Martin Sankén. Thank you. I think this was not intended to be a Q&A after this one, because we're pretty much on the tight schedule. You are around, so you can take questions during the lunch break. All right. Thank you very much for ironing out some of the complications here.